Who are the people who can't help but commit crime over and over? Let's find out, starting with number 6, the hottest mugshots. Chelsea Timp, once hailed for having the hottest mugshot ever by the social media account Mugshawtys, was back in the headlines after landing in legal trouble yet again. Mugshawtys, if you're unaware, is a social media phenomenon where mugshots of attractive women who have been arrested are shared online. It started as a gimmick account on Twitter and Instagram, gaining popularity and followers by posting these mugshots along with the alleged crimes committed by the individuals. Anyway, Timp got herself arrested on suspicion of contempt of court, slander, and resisting a court order, much to the delight of her fans. But this isn't Timp's first mugshot experience. She initially made waves when the McCracken County Sheriff's Office in Kentucky nabbed her. That arrest led to a viral smirking mugshot and a slew of admirers. Her arrest wasn't a walk in the park either. She was part of a big bust that saw a whopping 14 people get rounded up. The charges were serious, such as trafficking and even second-degree manslaughter. Taylor Johnson is another girl who was dubbed insanely beautiful by Mugshawtys, and she found herself plastered all over Instagram as well after being arrested on suspicion of driving while under the influence and possessing, let's just call it the green stuff. The post grabbed thousands of likes and comments, with fans swooning over her beauty. Johnson herself chimed in, expressing disbelief that her mugshot resurfaced 2 years later without her consent. We'd like to think it's because she's embarrassed, but who knows? Number 5, a mugshot from Honduras. Heidy Ulloa, a member of the MS-13 gang, caused a stir online with her eye-catching mugshot after being busted for trafficking in Honduras. Is there a Mugshawtys Honduras version? Ulloa was nabbed during a police operation in San Pedro Sula, where authorities seized a stash including 120 bags of that spicy powder, 20 bags of stuff you shouldn't step on or it'll break your mama's back, 6 bags of funky grass, 2 cell phones, and 900 lempiras, which is roughly $36. Okay, it was basically a whole bunch of illegal substances we won't name. Known as La Garra, or loose translation, the Claw, which is about as bad guy of a name as you can get. Ulloa was probably starting to get used to getting arrested. She had been busted twice for similar charges within 3 months back in 2022. While law enforcement hailed the operation as a win in the fight against illegal substance trafficking, social media users couldn't get enough of Ulloa's sultry mugshot, with some even offering to bail her out. In the midst of comments swooning over her looks, even a police officer shared his hope that Ulloa would turn her life around, emphasizing her beauty and lamenting her poor choices. Critics of Honduras' justice system question why Ulloa was released after previous arrests, contrasting the leniency with the tough approach taken by El Salvador's President Nayib Bukele in cracking down on gangs. It's weird that she's strongly associated with a gang that has a bad reputation, but people want to bail her out based on a mugshot. Human psychology is interesting. Number 4, the serial romancer. Emmanuel Scotts, a seasoned scammer, has been slapped with a hefty 12-year sentence for swindling over £320,000 from unsuspecting women he met on dating sites. Scotts, 55, wooed his targets online, persuading them to invest their savings, promising returns. But instead of making them rich, he funded his own lavish lifestyle with their hard-earned cash. After a rigorous trial, Scotts was convicted for 4 counts of fraud, cementing his status as a career con artist. He also copped to possession of fraudulent materials, including counterfeit credit cards, fake identification documents, and equipment used to create counterfeit cards. Acting Detective Chief Inspector David Vint didn't hold back, calling out Scotts for his heartless exploitation of innocent folks through romance scams. The City of London police didn't mince words either, vowing to hunt down fraudsters like Scotts and bring them to justice. The dedicated card and payment crime unit didn't let Scotts off the hook either. Their investigation revealed the depth of his crimes, tallying up his ill-gotten gains to a hefty £324,000. Detective Inspector Andrew Little, not one to sugarcoat things either, slammed Scotts for preying on his victims' emotion, leaving them shattered. He hoped the hefty sentence would help the victims rebuild their lives after falling victim to Scotts' deceitful games. Scotts' fraudulent activities weren't limited to romance scams. He and his wife, Emmanuel Scotts, were involved in various other scams. Last year, both Scotts and Scotts faced charges related to fraudulent activities, with Scotts admitting to conspiracy to commit fraud and Scotts to possession of the fraudulent materials. Their schemes included opening fake bank accounts, depositing fraudulent checks, and running VAT scams where they evaded taxes or falsely claimed refunds on luxury brands like Chanel. Their lavish lifestyle, funded by all their scams, included high-end items like designer shoes and properties in exclusive areas. Despite claiming benefits, they lived above their means, even posing as wealthy tourists to claim tax refunds on items they hadn't purchased legitimately. It's bad enough that Scotts was romance scamming enough to get 12 years behind bars, but it's a little worse that he has a wife that was okay with it, isn't it? Number 3, the NYU Finance Director. Cindy Tapp, a former finance director at New York University, admitted to orchestrating a $3.5 million fraud scheme, diverting funds meant for minority and women-owned businesses to fuel her lavish lifestyle and home renovations in Connecticut. Tapp's activities were revealed when NYU's Internal Audit Office uncovered her scheme, leading to criminal charges. Tapp, while at the university's Metropolitan Center for Research on Equity and Transformation of Schools, allegedly funneled $3.3 million to 2 shell companies she created. This money, part of $23 million in state grants, should have supported educational programs but ended up financing Tapp's personal expenses. The diverted funds, prosecutors claimed, were used not only for Tapp's personal luxuries, including extensive renovations and an $80,000 pool at her Connecticut home, but also to cover NYU-related costs. Tapp's legal woes extended beyond NYU. Despite landing a job as an operations manager at Yale's School of Medicine post-NYU, Tapp was suspended after news of her indictment broke. Yale, emphasizing its thorough vetting process, put her on leave, distancing itself from the scandal. Prosecutors painted a vivid picture, a tapestry, if you will, of Tapp's alleged financial mismanagement, accusing her of using state funding intended for educational programs to fund her extravagant lifestyle. Tapp pleaded not guilty to these charges, initially maintaining her innocence despite mounting evidence. However, Tapp did ultimately plead guilty to grand larceny, agreeing to 5 years probation and hefty restitution of $663,200. Despite her guilty plea, Tapp expressed remorse through her lawyer, Deborah Colson, who said that Tapp planned to fully repay the restitution before her sentencing. And that's the most sincere way to express remorse, right? Through your lawyer? What a bozo. Number 2, the Fake Traitor. An Anchorage man, Garrett Elder, got himself in some deep trouble after swindling over 175 people out of $26 million in a 6-year investment scam. Elder pleaded guilty to wire fraud and ended up with a 10-year sentence in federal prison. Elder's sentencing got quite emotional as his victims poured out their stories, detailing how his actions wrecked their lives. Some lost their savings, while others were left with anxiety and depression from the financial strain. The court heard contrasting views of Elder. Was he a slick con man or just in over his head? Prosecutors painted him as a smooth operator who duped family and friends, while his defense argued he was in too deep and thought he could trade his way out of trouble. It all started innocently enough with a $20,000 investment from his parents, but things went south. And soon, Elder was cooking up fake performance reports to keep his investors fooled. By the time authorities caught on, he had blown through millions and was living it up with private jets and fancy vacations. Despite facing charges, Elder didn't stop his shenanigans. He kept roping in new investors until a CPA noticed something fishy and tipped off regulators. Even then, he continued his schemes until finally confessing to the FBI in 2022. At sentencing, victims vented their anger, feeling that the recommended sentence was too lenient. They wanted Elder to face the maximum penalty, given the havoc he wreaked on their lives. In the end, the judge threw the book look at Elder, handing down a 10-year sentence, double what his defense requested. While some felt it wasn't enough, prosecutors were satisfied. 10 years is pretty brutal. Elder will have plenty of time to reflect on his actions as he begins his prison term, scheduled to self-surrender at a later date. If you're enjoying this video, be sure to stay tuned right here to find out how this guy was able to pull off the biggest wine fraud ever. Number 1. The serial internet Romeo. Serial con artist David Checkley, dubbed an Internet Romeo, got himself sent back to prison after swindling £111,000 from 10 women. Checkley, 65, preyed on vulnerable individuals, posing as a wealthy man or a Vietnam War vet on the dating app Plenty of Fish. Previously incarcerated for a fake Rolex deal that resulted with someone passing away, he indulged in luxury vehicles like Mercedes and Harley Davidsons with his stolen money. His scam mirrored a 2010 con where he pretended to need money for a phony terminal illness cure, landing him a 6-year prison sentence. Between February of 2017 and February of 2021, Checkley manipulated women in their 50s, 60s, and 70s by telling stories of his impressive background, including being a U.S. fighter pilot and a successful architect. He specifically targeted those recently out of relationships, lonely, and yearning for companionship. Using emotional manipulation, he borrowed money from them under false pretenses, claiming urgent needs like house repairs or to buy discounted Rolex watches. Guy likes his watches, we guess. One victim, Lise Johansson, not only lost her savings, but was left homeless due to Checkley's lies. He even stole her mother's eternity ring while they were wrapping Christmas gifts. Which is like, what? We can at least make sense out of stealing and ripping people off. Obviously, we don't agree with it, but we can at least see the logic. But stealing some old woman's ring that's supposed to symbolize the love of someone she loved but has passed away? Sometimes there's just no words. Found guilty of 19 fraud charges and 1 theft charge, Checkley faced sentencing from a judge who condemned his heinous actions. In court, David Checkley demonstrated his lack of remorse by his demeanor and behavior. Despite being convicted of 19 counts of fraud and 1 count of theft, the guy showed no signs of regret or remorse. He remained totally indifferent to the suffering he caused his victims and continued to portray himself as a suave and charming individual. Checkley's arrest followed his return from a vacation to Ibiza in July of 2021, with evidence found during a search of his victim's residence. Authorities found invoices related to the purchase of expensive jewelry, a brochure for a large mansion in Hertfordshire, and a receipt for a £7,250 Rolex watch purchased in 2018. There was applause from some victims at his sentencing, and the detective in charge of the case, John Rock, commended the victims for their bravery. Do you think 6 years is enough to get Checkley to change his ways? Or do you think he'll be right back at it again the minute he's released? In September 2003, some of Southern California's most elite wine lovers gathered at Melisse, a Santa Monica restaurant, to attend a $4,800 wine tasting hosted by Rudy Kernewayon. This was his coming out party in the ultra-exclusive wine world where he wanted to show that he was someone who belonged. While sampling rare wines that can be impossible to find, a few attendees were suspicious that they were being deceived. Prominent wine taster Paul Wasserman, whose mother was a prominent Burgundy importer, was unsure of the bottles he was served. Before the tasting, the oldest Petrus he'd had was from 1975, much older than the 1921 Petrus on offer that night. Vintage bottles of Petrus sold for almost $30,000 a bottle, and Kernewayon had an extensive supply. The 2 bottles that confused him the most were a 1961 Bordeaux that seemed far younger than Wasserman would have expected, and a 1947 Bordeaux that seemed to taste wrong. It's common for people to question the wine in the world of rare wines, although they would rarely do it out loud. Guests at tastings would want to avoid offending the host or making themselves look ignorant. When another guest told Wasserman that the 1961 Bordeaux tasted exactly the same as the last time they had it, he told himself it must be legitimate. Nothing about the wine's appearance seemed off. The colors were appropriate, and the labels seemed legitimate. Born in Indonesia, Kurniawan came to the United States to attend California State University on a student visa in the late 90s. His interest in wine started in 2001 at his father's birthday party. He tried a 1996 Opus 1, was fascinated by the taste. Living in the LA area at the time, he started searching the city for wine and soon had 200 bottles. He attended weekly tastings at a wine store in Glendale called the Red Carpet. At a charity auction in 2002, he bid on a hotly contested bottle of the cult California Syrah Sin Qua Non. He held his paddle up and waited until he won. Soon, he graduated from California Wines, moving on to Premier Cru Bordeaux. From there, his attention turned to Burgundy. Burgundy is one of the market's most revered wines. Produced in such small quantities that finding bottles can be a huge feat. Kurniawan had a refined palate and a strong memory, two traits that made him a gifted taster. He visited auction rooms and spent $1 million a month, becoming a strong presence in the market. His high bidding was so influential that old wine prices rose dramatically during that time. A bottle of 1945 DRC Romani Conti sold for $2,600 in 2002, but after Kurniawan joined the scene in 2003, it sold for $124,000. Kurniawan had a flashy sense of style, turning up to events in custom Hermes suits, Patek Philippe watches, selvage jeans, chrome hearts glasses, and crocodile boots. Inside his jacket's flap was a silk lining with a repeating cursive print of Rudy. He teased people for having a platinum Amex card when he had a Centurion card. While he sometimes had a woman on his arm or a brother visiting from Asia, he attended most events alone. Usually, he was about an hour late, which sometimes rubbed people the wrong way as he was seen as arrogant. It was rare that he spoke about his past. He'd tell people he moved from Indonesia to the US to attend Cal State and that his family owned a major Asian beer distributor. Apparently, his family gave him a monthly allowance to stay out of their hair. The little information he shared about his life changed frequently. Sometimes his monthly allowance was $1 million, and others it was as high as $2 million. Other details like the type of beer his family made also changed often. Few people knew details beyond that. Wasserman invited him over for dinner, but he always had an excuse for not going. He didn't seem to want to get too close to people. While he was distant, he was also very generous. The lineup of wines he had at tastings became critically renowned, with Wasserman singing his praises and Alan Meadows, a Burgundy collector and premier Burgundy critic, becoming a beneficiary of Kurniawan's largesse, having tried wines he'd never encountered before. Kurniawan was accepted and revered in the wine community, with Meadows even publishing tasting notes based on Kurniawan bottles. Arguably, Kurniawan's most strategic friendship was with John Capon, a New Yorker who wanted to turn his family's wine shop in the Upper West Side, Acker, Merrill, and Condit, into a key player at wine auctions. Capon introduced Kurniawan to the 12 Angry Men, a New York-based group of new collectors known for their high standards and who would be offended if somebody brought a cheap bottle of wine to a party. This connection was highly beneficial to Kurniawan, as the more he integrated himself into high-end wine circles, the more legitimate he looked. He had a fixation on Romani Conti and the 1947 vintage, earning him the nicknames Dr. Conti and Mr. 47. They would make a grandiose display of opening rare, expensive bottles at their tastings. Still, as Kurniawan integrated himself more into their circle, he opened bottles that outdid anything the 12 Angry Men produced. Online wine boards sang his praises as well. He'd post his tasting notes and be met with high praise. Some critics didn't like how much he was flaunting his wealth by talking about such expensive wines, but other online community members were quick to defend him, claiming that those critics were just jealous. He made his mark on the scene. The group would start their evenings at Kurniawan's, where they'd drink hyper rarities, like a bottle of 1945 Romani Conti that he supposedly bought for $2 million. They would leave Kurniawan's place and go to Cru, a Greenwich Village restaurant where he would order all of the expensive bottles off the wine list. After drinking expensive wine at Cru, Kurniawan had the restaurant send him the empty bottles. Wine aficionados often hold on to the bottles of costly or hard-to-find wines they've drunk, so it wasn't an unusual request. He told them he was building a bottle museum, which might have explained why he ordered more bottles than any other customer and took most of them home. Kurniawan was co-signing at auctions despite earning a reputation as a wine lover and buyer rather than a seller. In 2003, Eric Greenberg, an internet entrepreneur, knew something was wrong with the wine he purchased and reached out to Kerniawan. By the end of the conversation, Greenberg was sure Kerniawan was duped by whomever originally sold him the wine. Capin hosted a top 100 wines of the country weekend, charging $17,500 a head. Attendees tried 2 vintage bottles of Domaine de la Romanicanti. One bottle was a 1937, the other a 1945, which were rare finds that Kerniawan sold to Capin. Something tasted off with the wines, but most of them had never tried the 45 vintage before, and so weren't sure how it was supposed to taste. Meadows joked about only how there were probably less than 1,000 bottles of the 45 made, but many thousands of bottles had been drunk, insinuating that whoever sold Kerniawan the wine had lied to him. Nobody blamed Kerniawan, assuming that with his extensive collection, he was bound to end up with a few phony bottles. Capin believed Kerniawan's cellar was the greatest in the country, presided over Kerniawan's wine cellar auction, and called it the cellar. While the consignor was unnamed, insiders knew it was Kerniawan. Acker Auctions was a second-tier auction house, meaning they received consignments of a couple of bottles rather than an entire case. The cellar would be Acker's first single cellar sale. They sold 1,742 lots and brought in $10.6 million. It was such a hit that they held the Cellar 2 auction 9 months later, selling 2,310 lots at $24.7 million. Acker was now a key player in wine auctions. Kerniawan made $35 million from the auction. He splurged on exotic cars, including a Bentley and a Ferrari, started gutting an $8 million Bel Air house, and spent millions of dollars on contemporary art. He spoke to a reporter about the inevitability of encountering fake bottles, and that spotting them was an art he learned after trying so many wines and inspecting details like the bottles, labels, and corks. Some people were growing skeptical of Kerniawan. His bottles were rare, so having just one of them would be impressive, but he had entire cases. He brought bottles of 1923 Romeo Bonus Maris to auction, but the domain wasn't found until 1924. In 2007, leading Burgundy collector Don Stott hosted an event at his home with Christophe Romeo to sample some of Kerniawan's bottles. A guest pointed out that something was wrong with one of the bottle labels. While the details were correct, their position was reversed, as though the label was photocopied. It was clear that 6 out of the 11 bottles they opened were fake. Doug Barzilay, a Burgundy collector and good friend to Meadows, wondered if Kerniawan was intentionally selling fakes. It seemed like Kerniawan had been duped for a while, but it was happening so often that he could be participating in the operation. Bottles of fake wine were in circulation, and members of the scene needed to find out how. Stott started returning bottles he bought from Kerniawan to Acker, and crew began destroying all empty bottles. Noted wine collector Bill Koch hired an investigator to search his 43,000 bottle cellar for counterfeits. He hired an investigator who sent 4 Kerniawan source bottles to be inspected at their respective French chateaux. The chateaus reported that each bottle was fake. Kerniawan's mysterious wealth was running out. Construction on his Bel Air mansion came to a halt after he received 8 different lawsuits and countersuits. Acker filed a $1 million lien against him, and the money continued to grow, likely due to collectors returning bottles. By the end of that year, he'd racked up $7 million in debt to the auction house. He reached out to wine friends to lend him $1 million, and soon he was $11.5 million in debt. To obtain loans, he understated his liabilities and double-pledged collateral. He scrambled to find new outlets to sell more wine. In an April 2007 auction in Los Angeles, Christie's Los Angeles sent out a catalog that featured magnums of 1982 Le Pin, sourced by Kerniawan. Aficionados determined they were fakes, and they were pulled. Kerniawan sold $2.2 million worth of wine to Goldman Sachs partner and chairman of the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. Faking wine might be easier than it sounds and can be done by blending 2 vintage bottles. For example, a 1981 Petrus with a 1983 Petrus would theoretically make 2 bottles of 82 Petrus. While it might not taste exactly like an 82, it would be different enough from the 81 and 83 to be plausible, and this is precisely what Kerniawan did. Wines didn't always brand their corks with the winemaker, making it possible to put in a blank cork or ink it with the name of a winemaker. Labels can be soaked off an empty bottle and replaced with a laser-printed new one. Proving that old wines are fake is almost impossible. There isn't information about how many bottles of a particular wine were produced and what packaging was used. Old and rare wines aren't tasted enough for their flavors to be recognizable. Diagnosing a fake bottle is very difficult. Winemakers rarely declare a bottle as fake. Rare wines are typically opened by a generous host, so nobody would dare say they were drinking fake. Most people in the collectors community were male and loved to show off their collections to anybody they they encountered. Nobody in the group would admit to being duped. During an April 2008 Acker auction, Laurent Ponceau, maker of a coveted Burgundy featured in 22 lots at the auction, discovered that Kurniawan co-signed counterfeit vintages. Ponceau started making Domaine Ponceau in the 80s, but the catalog boasted 1959 and 1945 vintages. Barzilay told Ponceau about the situation, and they ordered Capin to pull the lots. Ponceau attended the auction to make sure that he did. The crowd started booing when Capin announced that they'd removed the Ponceau lots. It was a rowdy night, with the angry men's notes on the wines they drank getting more outrageous, and they seemed to want to bid on the wines anyway. Pulling so many bottles for being fake made Capin look completely illegitimate to an already suspicious group of experts, especially when it was becoming accepted that many of the wine lots he was selling were fake. The next day, Kurniawan and Capin had lunch with Ponceau and Barzilay. Kurniawan was evasive, saying he'd have to check his records to see where he got the bottles. Later, he emailed Ponceau to tell him that he bought the wines from a man named Pak Hendra in Asia. He gave Ponceau 2 numbers to call, but one went to a Jakarta shopping mall and the other to an Indonesian airline. To rebuild his reputation, Capin stopped accepting Kurniawan's consignments. Kurniawan's relationships with many people that he was once close with soured. Alan Meadows felt that Kurniawan took advantage of him, and some of the group wondered if he was opening authentic wines at tastings but selling counterfeit versions. He found a major auction house, Christie's New York, still willing to take his bottles. At the time, Christie's wine department was losing its footing in the market and needed product. Don Cornwell, a lawyer and wine aficionado, tried to warn Christie's about the fake bottles, but they still went ahead with the auction. A London auction was coming up, and Cornwell took to the popular online forum Wine Berserkers to warn that Kurniawan would be trying to auction wines there, but still wasn't taken seriously. A president of one of the 2 auction houses holding the sale responded that they had a thorough inspection process to weed out any fakes. The situation reached British online wine media and pressured auctioneers to withdraw inventory from Kurniawan, including 12 lots of DRC worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Bill Koch filed a civil case in 2009 against Kurniawan that was finally able to proceed after a breakthrough. The FBI had been quietly investigating him and discovered that he had lived in the country illegally since 2003 after the denial of his asylum application. His status turned him into a flight risk, leading the FBI to file a search warrant. On March 8, 2012, FBI agents knocked on his door early in the morning, and he was arrested in his pajamas. During their search of the house, the FBI found thousands of labels for top wines, including a 1947 Lafleur, Lafite, Romani Conti, and a 1950 Petrus, as well as hundreds of new and cold corks. He had a mechanical device for inserting them, lead capsules, sealing wax, and rubber stamps with vintages and chateau names. They also found glue, stencils, pattern scissors, and warm white Ingress drawing paper. He had detailed instructions on fabricating labels for 1962 Domaine Ponceau Clos de Roche and bottles of cheap Napa Valley wine that he'd marked with the names of old Bordeaux wines. Bottles were soaking in the kitchen sink to make it easier to remove their labels. The evidence against Kurniawan didn't just hurt his reputation. People who went into business with him dealt a blow to their credibility, like Paul Wasserman, who stored and traded some of his wine. Many believe that Wasserman was too much of an expert in the field to be deceived by Kurniawan. His respected family name was tarnished, and his knowledge of old wine was questioned. After all, he posted tasting notes of Kurniawan's wines. Capin and Meadows also wrote notes on Kurniawan wines, having given him the benefit of the doubt despite indicators that he wasn't who he seemed. Wasserman hoped he'd once sold legitimate wines and only started co-signing counterfeit bottles when he faced financial troubles. After being indicted in New York, Kurniawan faced up to 100 years in jail for 4 counts of mail and wire fraud. Directors Jerry Rothwell and Ruben Atlas met at Kurniawan's trial. Rothwell was following Laurent Ponceau on the trial of his counterfeit wine. Atlas read about the trial in New York Magazine and was intrigued by Kurniawan, who at his core was a thief but only stole from the wealthy. The pair spent a lot of time together and soon decided to tell Kurniawan's story. Earlier in his career, he was followed by a film crew and intended to make a food and wine show, although it never materialized. Atlas and Rothwell obtained the footage and began making the documentary Sour Grapes. Originally, they wanted an interview with Kurniawan but never got time with him. The story's angle changed, and their focus went from the con man to the con. Some collectors didn't want to be filmed as they were too embarrassed that they were duped. At first, Atlas was rooting for Kurniawan, who targeted people with money to blow. Over time, his opinion changed after learning more about the people he conned and the winemaking process. Cox investigators were the first to discover that Kurniawan's real name was Zhen Wang Huang, although he didn't find this suspicious as ethnic Chinese often adopt local names. Kurniawan wasn't the first person in his family to act as a con man. His uncles were imprisoned for committing massive fraud, allegedly stealing $800 million that was never recovered. As of February 2012, Kurniawan still owed $3.5 million to Acker, Merrill, and Condit from loans they'd given him. In April 2013, Kurniawan faced 2 additional charges, one for selling 6 bottles of Domaine Georges Roumier Bon Maris 1923 for $95,000, worth just under $130,000 today, despite Domaine Georges Roumier not producing wine until 1924, and another for selling Jeroboam of Chateau Mouton Rothschild 1945 for almost $50,000, worth roughly $65,000 in today's money. In December 2013, the jury found him guilty, and in August 2014, he received a 10-year sentence in federal prison. Koch and Kurniawan settled their lawsuit out of court in July 2013 for $3 million in damages. In January 2015, the authentic wines in his collection sold for $1.5 million. After his November 2020 release, Immigration and Customs Enforcement took him into custody, and in April 2021, they deported him back to Indonesia. All told, he sold roughly 12,000 fake bottles, thousands of which are probably still in people's private collections. Click to watch one of these next videos. Let us know in the comments section what you'd rather have: free phone and internet service for life, or free Ubers for life.